Hello to all my viewers. How was your week? I hope all is going well. Well, I'm here to bring you the 9th episode of What If Naruto Was from the Uchiha clan. Remember that I'll be uploading this fanfic little by little since it's my own creation, and the previous chapters are on my channel. Without further ado, I'll let you enjoy it.
Daimyo booth. The 5 daimyo were all chatting civilly while they waited for the second round to start, each praising their own favorites remaining in the tournament. The most vocal of the feudal lords was the fire daimyo, who had chosen his favorite to be Naruto after watching the boy's impressive performance against Sasuke Uchiha, who was acclaimed as a genius even among Uchiha standards, but then again very few even knew what those standards were. Oh my! Everyone sure is excited today. Very excited indeed, the fire daimyo said with a small smile hidden behind his folding fan as he looked out at his people. Citizens of Hai no Kuni. The lightning daimyo, who had his cheek resting in his palm, looked at the crowd with an uninterested gaze before he turned to face the fire daimyo with a small, condescending smirk. Yes, quite the difference from the death chants they were shouting from the top of their lungs yesterday. That was quite the sight. The lightning daimyo said haughtily, not really caring what the civilians were saying, since he never trusted shinobi after the second Raikage tried to revolt against his father and bring Kaminari no Kuni under one singular rule under his reign. Ever since then, he made sure to have special limiters in place to prevent such an attempt from happening under his reign as feudal lord. The fire daimyo snapped his fan shut, and a serious look took place on his usually aloof-appearing facial features, as if he was looking at the monsters that were hiding under the skin of his citizens. Yes, when I asked Minato-san if there were any repercussions lingering after the Kyuubi's attack, he assured me there were none. It appears he was mistaken. The fire daimyo admitted, closing his eyes and shaking his head lightly. A small smile worked its way back onto his face when he opened his eyes again. Despite what they say, I believe that young Naruto did wonderfully. This was where the wind daimyo inserted himself into the conversation, with his thin mustache curling down as his fat face contorted down into a slight scowl at the mention of the boy who was a Jinchuriki. Why does it matter what the plebeians think of our tools? That's all a Jinchuriki is, an over-glorified tool used to make the hidden village stronger and by proxy us as well. The feudal lord from Kaze no Kuni expressed his opinion confidently as he looked ahead, but at what no one could tell due to the high degree at which his eyes were squinted. Well then, does that mean that your village is sporadic? I mean that Gaara brat is mentally unstable on his best day, so what does that say about your village any? The daimyo from Mizu no Kuni asked, since he was irritated that they could not find his Jinchuriki. So what could he do? He could insult the other village's human sacrifices. The fire and earth daimyo ignored the other 3 as they got into yet another pointless argument over things that really held no relevance to the matter on hand. The 2 silent feudal lords watched as the 3 proctors made their way back onto the combat field. Combatant booth. Naruto stood there with Suisei, who was not showing her Sharingan. On his shoulder, his blood-red eyes taking in the sights around him with an impassive sweep of the stadium. Naruto ignored the fact that all of the competitors left in the booth were regarding him a lot more wearily than they had done during the first 2 days of the tournament. Well, almost everyone, Naruto thought with a small sigh as he watched a mop of red hair invade his peripheral vision. Naruto glanced from the corner of his eye at Naomi, who took advantage of everyone keeping their space from Naruto to start a small conversation. I can scare her by flying at her face and dragging my talons across her face for you if you want, Naruto-kun. Suisei offered her partner, getting a contemplative hum from Naruto, but ultimately ended with him saying no and Suisei huffing while muttering about not being able to have any fun. Naruto stood there silently waiting for his sister to speak, which is why he assumed she made her way over to him. Naomi stood there silently trying to find the courage to speak to her brother, while an uncomfortable atmosphere surrounded the two, at least in Naomi's opinion. Taking a deep breath, Naomi tried to start from square one, starting off the conversation with her brother. Hello Nissan. I know you might not want to talk about it, but can I ask why you didn't tell anyone about your Sharingan? Naruto's head turned and he faced her, making her squirm slightly when the cursed eyes peered right into her soul. Naruto closed his eyes and turned back to face the field, getting Naomi to release the breath she was not aware that she was holding from the moment he looked at her. Naruto looked back out at the field, and Naomi was the only one who was able to see the bitterness in his eyes. This village and I are not on the best terms, and I certainly wouldn't trust the people here to keep my secret from the filth in this village. Naruto retorted, harshly, getting a small nod from Naomi since her opinion was pretty much the same after the fiasco yesterday. Suisei, sensing Naruto's turmoil through their soul link, nudged her head against his cheek, voicing her support with a small caw, getting Naruto to crack a small, thankful smile. Naruto took notice that Naomi looked like she was struggling to say what she wanted to say to him next. Naruto decided to give his younger sister a small nudge in the right direction just so she would speak. "Is there something else, Naomi?" Naruto asked, using her name, getting her to look up at him with surprise evident in her eyes. The surprise quickly gave way to a look of determination, which was just what Naruto wanted. "Yua, I saw how you were able to use the wind to create armor for yourself, and I was wondering if you could help me with my wind training." Naomi blurted her request out as quickly as she could while she still had the confidence to do so. She glanced up at Naruto timidly to see how he reacted to her request, but to her relief and slight unease, he showed no visible reaction to what she had asked for. Naruto remained calm thanks to his training under Mihawk and Itachi as he pondered over her request. While he had come to realize that it wasn't his sisters who had caused him pain intentionally, if he agreed to help her it would put him too close to those who had been the primary causes of pain in his life, and those were the same people he truly could say he despised. "No, I can't help you with your training. I am not necessarily a good teacher or even a competent one. Besides, I am sure Minato is more than capable of aiding you in training. Besides, after what happened yesterday, I don't think it would be wise for one of Konoha's princesses to associate with the demon willingly. The villagers will go ballistic." Naruto knew what had happened before he arrived thanks to Suisei, who told him of what happened, and sadly, it was just like Naruto had expected. Hatred just does not go away, and most in Konoha were so lost in the abyss of their hatred that no matter what he could do would fix not a thing. "I don't care what the villagers think. They are all idiots, and I don't want Tsunade to train me. I want to spend time with my Nisan." Naomi argued back stubbornly since she was tired of the unfair villagers that started to show their true colors, validating that letter Naruto left all those years ago. Naruto looked at her for a few moments and shook his head since Naomi just couldn't grasp the bigger picture of things. As the daughter of the Hokage, she was expected to hold a certain amount of political weight in the future, and even now. "Naomi, you need to listen to me. If you associate with me, the idiots in the stands will believe that I have you under some sort of spell to make you a demon lover and will call for my execution to free you. I know what Minato said yesterday, but if he was to kill a majority of the people here, then the village would become unstable, and then the entirety of Konoha will be in danger." Naruto told his naive sister the truth despite how cruel it sounded. That was just how the world rotated. Naomi frowned but said nothing because what could she say to that? It was not something she could come up with a counter to. At least not yet. With that, both Naruto and Naomi fell into silence and waited for Akatsuchi and Yugito to kick off the first match of the second round, each having their own thoughts on the interaction they had just shared. Combat field. Akatsuchi gave the two-tails Jinchuriki his usual dopey smile, which Yugito returned with a small smile of her own, glad that she didn't have to deal with any of the people who seemed to be overflowing with arrogance. "All right, kitten, now is your chance to impress your future mate. So make sure that you win this match, then you and he can go celebrate your victory from the rest of the day." The Nibi purred with excitement just thinking of the pleasure she would feel from the time Yugito and Naruto would spend together. Yugito was glad that she was focused in on the seriousness of the situation, or else she'd be blushing up a storm. "Not now, Nibi, it is time to get serious." The large Iwagakure shinobi sprinted forward, his fist encased by a giant stone, striking first to avoid Yugito from using her advantage in the department of speed. Yugito quickly flipped backwards as Akatsuchi's fist smashed down where she was just standing. Yugito slid in front of Akatsuchi and delivered two fists straight to his solar plexus, but the larger nin shrugged off the blows as if they were simple taps. Yugito frowned, seeing that her taijutsu was not enough to crack the earth armor of Akatsuchi. Akatsuchi swung his arm to the side at Yugito and his forearm smashed right into the two Yugito brought up to protect herself. Yugito thanked her rapping sensei for building up her team's pain tolerance, because that one attack felt like getting rammed by the painful end of a sledgehammer. Yugito didn't want to feel what it felt like to be hit squarely by an attack like that. Akatsuchi whipped his fist out at Yugito, forcing her to rock back on her feet to bend out of the path of the attack. Hooking her foot around his heel, Yugito spun around so that she was facing his back in an impressive feat of flexibility. Taking a kunai, Yugito plunged the blade deeply into the back of his shoulder. As soon as the kunai was buried into the large man's back, his body started to lose shape before it fell to nothing more than a pile of mud at Yugito's feet, getting the Kumo Jinchuriki to skim the area for her opponent. Yugito whirled around half expecting to find the large man closing in with a sneak attack, yet there was none. The stadium fell silent, most searching along with Yugito, wondering just how such a large man could have hidden himself. Well, those not in tune with the shinobi lifestyle thought that. Yugito was starting to lose her patience when her tenant suddenly shouted something to her. "He's below." The Nibi alerted her container, but just a moment too late, because as she looked down, a large stone fist was already mid-flight and directly aiming for her exposed stomach. Yugito bit down on her tongue to keep out from crying out in pain as she felt the oxygen momentarily stripped from her lungs. Spitting up a small amount of blood, Yugito's slitted eyes glared at the cheerful rock shinobi. She knew he wasn't insulting her with that look, but in the heat of battle it felt like an insult, like he wasn't taking her seriously. "You need to calm down, kitten. You are working yourself up over nothing." Yugito, hearing the calm voice of her trusted companion, allowed herself a moment to cool her head. It was times like this that Yugito was glad she had Nibi to keep her calm and avoiding making potentially fatal mistakes. "My taijutsu doesn't have enough force to crack that armor, so using the cat claws would be pointless. I can't do any kind of genjutsu thanks to all the chakra I have. It is time to dip into my ninjutsu," Yugito said to herself, channeling her chakra into her throat, creating a burning feeling to intensify. Yugito used one of the Two Tails' favorite fire-style technique. Fire release, mouse hairball. Yugito spat out a ball of hair that was quickly set ablaze by the blue flames that surrounded the Two Tails like fur. Akatsuchi, who had just climbed out of the ground when the ball of flaming hair turned into a mouse before it split itself 10 times in mid-flight. 6 of the 10 mouse-shaped fireball projectiles pelted Akatsuchi at different angles, making the boy yelp out in shock as the fire was hot enough to burn through his earth armor. Yugito let a pleased smirk flash across her face as she broke through the large man's armor with her first jutsu. Akatsuchi dropped his earth armor since it took up a lot of chakra, and Yugito proved that she could get through it. The usual happy and almost clueless expression on the large man's face changed into an uncharacteristically serious expression. Akatsuchi buried his hands into the soil below him, and Yugito was forced to watch as the once solid ground shifted into a liquid mud-like substance that continued to grow and expand in its width. Earth release. Mud flow river. Leaping into the air, Yugito fired another mouse fireball, heating the mud up so she could have a small island to stand atop of. That served to backfire on the Kumogakure Jinchuriki as the current of the river whirled around the small island, creating a muddy whirlpool around her. Yugito thought about jumping into the air, but then she would leave herself vulnerable to an attack while being stuck in midair. Yugito watched as the mud splashed up into the air from the sheer force and velocity of its rotations and knew that falling would spell her defeat. Yugito narrowed her eyes, seeing Akatsuchi still with his hands in the dirt, which was something that she could use. Cocking her leg back, Yugito focused her chakra down to the appendage, and with a whip-like motion her leg flew outwards towards Akatsuchi, propelling a whip of fire to lash towards Akatsuchi over the muddy river. Fire release. Extreme heat whip. The orange flames flew towards a surprised but alert Akatsuchi before changing into the blue flames often associated with the Nibi, at least in the village hidden in clouds. Akatsuchi released his hold over the river, getting the ground to shift back to a solid surface, and in exchange a wall of solid stone rose up in front of him with the top half of his earth golem projecting from the middle of the wall. And, just like Kakashi has the ninja hound heads, the flame whip slammed into the wall, leaving a heavy, black scorch mark. Yugito leaped forward and climbed the wall like a tree, so she was standing on top of the wall peering down at Akatsuchi, who took notice of her presence moments after she got there. Yugito dive-bombed at Akatsuchi as he tried to crumble the wall. With her claws out and pointed at him, she began to spin. Spiraling claw. Yugito claws blurred together to look like one torpedo as she flew down at Akatsuchi, who had just gotten back onto his feet. The IWA shinobi brought his guard up, hoping to absorb some of the impact, but his eyes widened when he felt a terrible pain on his left side. Gripping the origin of his pain, he could feel his jacket torn up and saturated with his blood, and that was when he realized that she was too fast for him to handle now that he was wounded. Akatsuchi looked behind him when footsteps alerted him to his opponent's approach, but he couldn't find it in him to move. Yugito spread her claws so that they were on each side of his throat, just on the off chance that the large earth nin had some form of fight in him. It would be best if you forfeited the match. Yugito stated seriously, slightly pushing her claws into his skin, getting light lines to open and bleed slightly to make the threat all the more realistic. Akatsuchi knew he was done and had no plans on being stubborn about it. Give. Akatsuchi choked out the blood loss starting to affect his motor functions, and as the proctor named Yugito the winner, the large man was taken back to medics for treatment. Combatant booth. What did you guys think? Yugito asked with a playful smirk as she entered the booth to be greeted by her two teammates, almost immediately getting a smile from the blonde Jinchuriki. Karui was practically exploding with boisterous praise for her teammate, while Samui indicated her approval with a much cooler nod of the head. Yugito chuckled at the quirks each member of her team seemed to possess. Yugito glanced over to Naruto only to sigh when she saw he was not even glancing in her direction. She had really hoped to get some kind of word with the young man with the red eyes. Realizing where her thoughts were going, she stopped them cold. Wait, why do I even care what Naruto-san thinks of me? Yugito asked, surprised by her own thoughts, while Nibi decided to add in her own 2 cents. Why, kitten, it is only natural that you want the approval of your mate. The Nibi purred out, getting an angered and embarrassed blush from her container as they went to argue about how Naruto was or was not her mate. Yash, it is my turn to prove just how brightly my flames of youth can get. Soon the whole world will see just how splendid I am. Lee burst out loudly, no longer able to hold back his youthful impulses from breaking his excited surface. His eyes were ablaze with the fires of battle in the normally black orbs. Fu, who had the honor of being closest to Lee when he had his youthful eruption, could only back away uncomfortably due to Lee's intense personality. All right, Fu stated slowly, not really sure what she was agreeing with, but thankfully it would seem that Lee didn't hear her unsure reply. Not able to stay in place any longer, Lee launched himself over the railing down onto the field below. The Tsunade Jinchuriki stood in position away from everyone else because most were afraid to stay too close to him. The closest person to Gaara was Naruto, who just didn't care who he was near, and neither did Gaara. Gaara watched Lee look up at him, and he let a grin flash across his face so quickly missed it looking right at him. Gaara disappeared inside of a sand shunshin with one thought going through his mind. Just how will your blood dye my sand? Combat field. Lee's cheerful disposition was quickly replaced by a serious and determined expression once Gaara arrived on the field across from him. The fuzzy-browed Chunin hopeful, just like everyone present, remembered the brutal efficiency Gaara displayed during the first day of the exams, which made him wearier around the youngest of the Sand Waterfall siblings. Lee, though, felt the unyouthful feeling of disdain for how Gaara treated his longtime crush, Sakura. Lee silently vowed to avenge Sakura's unnecessarily brutal defeat. Gaara, on the other hand, was showing nothing, but if one was to look into his pale blue eyes, they would find the hunger for blood in those void eyes. Lee pulled up his leg warmers, showing off the weights he had strapped around his shins, which Lee moved to get rid of right off the bat. Gaara allowed this since it would be more enjoyable that way when he took the blood forcibly from Lee's body. Dropping each weight to one side, resulting in a crater, Lee disappeared from the sight of many of the genin as he began racing around the Tsunade Jinchuriki. Gaara stood there confidently as his sand swirled around him protectively. His absolute defense, which was the defense that had yet to be broken even against the assassins in the village, his sand held strong. Lee came to a sudden halt behind Gaara with a strong right aimed straight at the back of his skull, but was intercepted by a blast of sand that caught his hand. Flashes of what happened to Sakura's arm went through Lee's head, quickly forcing him to leap back and become an indistinguishable blur. Gaara didn't bother to try and search for Lee because he knew that his opponent had to come to him. Not a moment later, Lee's leg was smashed against Gaara's sand, sending some grains over his kanji for love, engraved on the side of his forehead. This time, when Lee leaped back, the sand followed him like a wave that threatened to engulf him. Gaara's mother voiced its displeasure when it did not feel any kind of unnatural disturbance underneath the large amount of sand from Gaara's gourd. "Hurry, Gaara. I want his blood," came the slightly crazed voice of his mother from deep in Gaara's mind, accompanied by a much more frenzied sand that swirled around the auburn-haired Jinchuriki. Upon Gaara's silent command, the sand flew at Lee, making the green spandex-wearing genin kick it up a notch in the opposite direction of the incoming sand. Gaara grinned when some of his sand looped around the ankle of his opponent, making him stumble out of his quick strides. Lee threw a powerful kick that broke his ankle free from the sand shackle, ultimately saving it from being demolished under the sand's crushing force. Lee saw the sand all crushed down on where his ankle was just moments prior and breathed a small sigh of relief before racing towards Gaara with determined eyes. Lee easily avoided the blasts of sand that Gaara tossed at him to keep him away and got within the Tsunade Genin's defensive guard. Not wanting to waste his first meaningful opportunity against his sand-wielding opponent. Tensing his arm to support his weight, Lee drove his foot with incredible force, taking Gaara off his feet and knocking him up into the air. Why is his body so dense? Lee thought, feeling how his foot impacted Gaara and how heavy the Jinchuriki felt. However, Lee did not have any time to think on the development as he pushed off his hands up into the air under Gaara. Lee started to kick Gaara straight into the air, getting both shinobi to elevate from the driving force behind the mighty kicks. There it is again. My kicks are not doing nearly as much damage as they should. Lee growled as the strain on his muscles from the upside-down kicks was starting to become notable, but luckily for Lee they were at the top of their flight pattern. Lee, using his incredible speed, moved behind Gaara much like he had during his first round match and wrapped up Gaara as tightly as he could, not needed to hold back on the auburn-haired genin. Their bodies began to spin quickly as they plummeted back down to the ground 10 times faster than the speed they had used to get up there. Front Lotus, Lee cried out as the spinning mass of bodies neared the ground. Remembering Kuratsuchi's advice from the first round, Lee waited to the very last moment before releasing his bindings. A thick cloud of dust filled the air as Gaara's body slammed into the ground. Lee stood there with a victorious smirk on his face as he waited for the dust to clear and what no doubt would be an unconscious and hopefully not dead Gaara. No matter how tough he was, being dropped on your head at that speed without a chance to brace would lead to certain defeat. Lee was brimming with pride because not only had he proven his mettle as a splendid shinobi, but he was also able to get a measure of payback for his beloved Sakura. With the moment of rest came the lack of adrenaline, making Lee drop to a knee in fatigue. When the dust cleared, Lee's jaw went limp for a moment before the fiery expression returned full force, because Gaara was indeed lying on his head, but around his head was sand that cushioned Gaara, saving him from the deadly impact of the front lotus. Gaara got back onto his feet while Lee was trying to figure out what happened, since he was sure that he had Gaara pinned, stopping him from manipulating the sand. Lee got his answer when the sand that was on the ground formed to take a shape of a gourd, which was now resting on Gaara's back. Lee silently cursed Gaara's versatile sand as he tried to recover from the physical toll his body experienced during the prolonged setup to the front lotus, which required him to open Kaimon, Gate of Opening. Lee watched as Gaara commanded his sand to bind Lee, which it did without question. Taking a deep breath, Lee could feel the sand crawling around his legs and steadily getting higher and higher. Gaara's grin threatened to split his face, believing that Lee had given up and he was about to kill the fuzzy-browed genin. Kumon Kai, Gate of Healing Release. Lee took a deep breath as he felt his energy start to return to his body, as well as how his body felt lighter. Simon Kai, Gate of Life Release. Lee's skin started to turn red as blood flow increased to each and every muscle in his body. An intense pulse of energy blasted the sand from his body, revealing him to everyone in the stadium. I can use the reverse lotus now, but Gaara is tough and durable. I need to power up all of the way. Lee thought as he started to unlock the next gate, as everyone watched on in some form of surprise. Shaman Kai, Gate of Pain Release. Lee could feel the enormous amount of chakra flowing through his body thanks to the open gates and grit his teeth. He still had one more to go. Taman Kai, Gate of Limit Release. Lee fluidly switched from the powering up position to his standard strong fist taijutsu style with a fierce determination within his pure white eyes. In the stands, he can open 5 of the 8 inner gates? Kakashi asked in shock, a far shift from his usual laid-back, hip attitude as Guy would call it. The feat of opening any of the gates was extremely difficult even for a talented, seasoned jounin like Kakashi, yet here a genin could manage to open 5 of them. This was a sentiment shared by all of the jounin except for Lee's teacher, who had personally taught his clone the taijutsu forbidden technique. Lee, this is your power? The Hyuga prodigy of Team 9 thought as he watched his teammate ascend to a realm of power Niji could only hope to reach one day. It was a real eye-opener for the boy obsessed with fate to see someone he deemed inferior to clearly outclass him. Guy, how can you lecture me about teaching Sasuke my Chidori when you taught the 8 inner gates to a genin? Kakashi asked indignantly, since his rival had wasted no time in questioning his judgment with how he taught Sasuke. My reason for teaching Lee the 8 inner gates is personal. Much like me, Lee had no skills in Gen or ninjutsu, but he had the strongest desire to become a splendid shinobi. He reminded me so much of me that I felt obligated to help him succeed. Guy said seriously, his fists clenching slightly as he gazed down proudly at his protege. Guy-sensei, what are these 8 inner gates you keep referring to? Shino asked curiously, turning his head so that he could face the spandex-wearing Jounin, his glasses reflecting a shimmer almost as if they were resonating his curiosity. I am glad you asked that most youthful question, Shino. The 8 gates limit the overall flow of chakra within a person's body. The idea of the chakra gates comes from the body's limits on the functions that go on within it. This makes the body much weaker, but it keeps the body from expiring or killing itself. Lee and I have undergone intense training, so we could learn how to open these gates, allowing us to surpass our own unyouthful physical limits by each gate opened. Guy explained with his usual jovial attitude, returning full force, getting Asuma to let a sweat drop form while wondering if he was bipolar. Kiba let out an impressed whistle when he heard what Guy was telling them. It was basically that each gate opened made you increasingly stronger than you were originally. That gave Kiba maybe his best idea since he had coupled with Akamaru. Wait. So what happens when you open all 8 of the gates? You obtain power that surpasses even Kage-level shinobi. Guy replied proudly with a beaming grin, but just as quick as it came it left. But your body will also turn to ash from frying your body. Guy admitted with a slight frown, since no one had ever survived opening the final gate. The genin that had accumulated in the stands were all filled with an awe, seeing just how strong one of their own really was. It showed them just how much work they needed to put in if they were to have any chance of surviving in the shinobi world. Combat field. Here I go. Lee whispered before taking off at an inhumane speed straight for Gaara, who tried to use his sand to impede and possibly prevent Lee's charge, but to no avail. Lee flashed in front of Gaara, and with a swift uppercut powered by a massive amount of chakra, Gaara was knocked high into the air. Lee proceeded to strike and bash Gaara hundreds of times while in midair from one point to the next. The amount of pure energy burning off Lee left a visible pathway in the air from where he and Gaara were traveling, and large splatter like marks marking where Gaara and Lee paused and where Lee attacked. The inhumane attack continued on for the better half of the next moment, leaving the crowd captivated by the talents displayed by the fuzzy-browed genin. With a yell of equal parts determination and pain, Lee ended the reverse lotus forbidden taijutsu with a closed hand strike and kick, at the same time sending Gaara spiraling down into the ground with a fierce bang that sounded like a gunshot. Hovering midair, the red hue of Lee's skin faded back to a much more normal skin complex, with sweat dripping down his temples, the strain of the technique evident on Lee's face. The crowd all started to speak in a hushed whisper that had all blended together into an indistinguishable noise. Not that Lee heard anything, his vision and all his senses were solely focused on the teen with kanji for love on his head. Nothing else mattered. Falling to the ground was too much for Lee's battered body to handle, and he collapsed onto his chest, panting heavily as he kept one eye on the site of Gaara's impact. Lee groaned. He could feel that a number of his muscles were torn at various places on his body, but he knew the consequences in using the reverse lotus. Slowly, a silhouette of a short teen appeared in the cloud of dirt and rocks and walked through the veil, and to the shock of most it was Gaara, and he appeared to not have a scratch on him. Lee was left in a state of disbelief as he looked at Gaara, who was grinning maliciously at his bewildered opponent. That was when everyone saw that there was sand falling from Gaara's body, chipped at places where Gaara was struck the most, but in those places was Gaara's unblemished skin. The sand armor eventually fell to the ground around Gaara's feet, with small red specks littering the grains of sand. Lee couldn't believe his eyes. Not only had he spent himself hitting Gaara with his best and strongest attack, yet Gaara was showing no sign of discomfort. Lee felt the fumes he was already running out start to go dry. Lee growled slightly when the auburn-haired Jinchuriki's sand started to swirl around Gaara, like it wasn't happy at what Lee had just tried to do to Gaara, but Lee shrugged it off. Dropping into a very weak form of his taijutsu style, Lee bit down the groan when his torn muscles moved to accommodate what he had forced them to do. Combatant Booth. Why is there all that red in the sand? I don't see any open wounds on Gaara or Lee. Narumi asked while looking at the sand at the Tsunade genin's feet with an intensity that Naruto naturally produced. Everyone took a closer glance at what Narumi had pointed out, and two wondered just what was going on. Yuna, who had a sneaking suspicion about what the red specks were, looked over to the one person she knew could see what it was, Naruto. You can see. What is that stuff, Naruto-san? Yuna asked while looking over to the teen with the crow on his shoulder, hoping he would answer or she'd feel really awkward about trying to talk to him. Naruto's Sharingan spun lazily as he looked down at the sand, already determining what the red in Gaara's sand was. Naruto turned slowly to face Yuna with his Sharingan still spinning around, ignoring the fact everyone else was still looking at him. Yuna fought down the red that threatened to flood her cheeks when Naruto began to speak. "That is not blood but trace amounts yokai," Naruto said plainly before turning back to the field. "Yokai?" Choji took a moment's pause in his snacking to question the word Naruto had used, but it was clear Naruto would not be the one to answer. Fu, Yugito, Samui and Yuna all looked over to Choji and Shikamaru, who were looking at them with questioning glances. "You don't what yokai is?" Yokai is basically the chakra of a demon, usually a tailed beast, is the origin. Yugito informed the clueless portion of the booth that included more than Choji and Shikamaru. It was a matter Yugito knew plenty about, having one of those so-called demons sealed inside of her stomach. Combat field. Lee watched on helplessly as the sand flew at him, but his pride would not allow him to quit the match no matter how often the proctor seemed to ask. Lee tried to throw a wobbly punch at the sand, but the sand morphed its shape to cast itself around his forearm. Lee looked tiredly at Gaara's opened hand and tried his best to glare at his opponent. The action only seemed to amuse Gaara, and with a quick clenching off his hand, Lee could feel his right forearm shatter in multiple places. Lee's mouth opened up in a silent scream, but the fuzzy-browed genin still stubbornly held onto his conscience. "Watch as the sand runs red with your blood," Gaara demanded with quiet voice that held an undertone of bloodlust within the gravely sound. Lee closed his eyes in a resigned fashion, refusing to quit as the sand continued to slowly swarm around his body all the way up to his neck. Gaara started to close his fingers and Lee could feel the pressure slowly starting to increase, but before Lee could be compressed under the sand, there was an explosion of sand. Once the sand returned to Gaara's person, there stood Guy with his arm outstretched and a grave look on his face. "That's enough, I won't let you harm my precious student any further," Guy said with so much devotion and love that it made the emotionless Gaara actually wince as he looked Guy with a questioning look. Questioning why he would do something like that for someone who was weak and not for himself. Another voice whispered love, but it wasn't the voice Gaara called mother. It was a much softer voice that he hadn't heard before. Gaara watched as Guy went to check on the unconscious yet still standing Rock Lee, gripping his head to try and quell the confusing thoughts storming his head. Winner by forfeit? Gaara Sabaku. Gaara did not acknowledge anything as he went back to the booth, still holding his head and his sand whipping about violently, as if echoing the storm of emotions he was feeling. Every person moved away from the evident danger of Gaara's sand as the boy in mention looked up at each, and every person seeming them move away only further to intensify the emotions Gaara had thought he locked away. The only two being in the booth who weren't bothered were Naruto, who never broke from his calm demeanor, and Suisei, since she knew Naruto was right there. Gaara's white eyes that were blank to anyone else were desperate when they met Naruto's calm red Sharingan. Gaara's eyes widened momentarily as his hands dropped down to his side and his sand calmed down as well. The auburn-haired Jinchuriki couldn't describe it, but he felt a strange serene feeling sweep through him. Combat field. Karui instantly pressed on her sword-driven fury from the moment that the proctor had begun the match. Not wanting to be split in half, Naomi quickly dashed to her left as the shining steel of Karui's sword as it came in a downward slash. Naomi felt the pressure of actually having her elder brother watching her match. It was this pressure that hatched the idea that if she was to showcase her ability with wind, then maybe she could convince Naruto to help her hone her wind affinity. Naomi swayed back, using her natural flexibility to bend back so Karui's sword would harmlessly pass over the front of her face. Naomi swept up a pebble as she dragged her hand across the ground with a small smile as she evaded a follow-up slash from her fellow redhead. Naomi kicked Karui in the hands, making the Kumo Kunoichi grimace and back off momentarily. Flicking her wrist, the daughter of the Hokage sent the pebble she had taken zooming past Karui's ear, confusing the girl as to why her opponent used a rock on her. Though when her amber eyes went to where Naomi was, all she could see was a plume of smoke filling the air. Her questioning was ended when there was a sharp impact at her ribs, then sent her tumbling backwards. Karui managed to stop her momentum by burying her sword in the ground. She substituted with that rock after she threw it, knowing I wouldn't think anything of a small rock. Karui growled to herself as she pulled her sword out of the ground and placed it on its rightful place on her back. Karui knew that focusing in on kenjutsu like her partner Omoi who probably make her shinobi career difficult, but that didn't mean she didn't learn a few jutsu to help her out of tight situations like the one she found herself in against one of Konoha's princesses. Going through a series of seals, Karui put her hands on the ground and shouted out resolutely, "Lightning release." Shocking inspiration. The lightning release technique raced towards Naomi with a startling amount of speed. However, Naomi had prepared herself from the moment Karui began her signs. With a chakra-enhanced jump, Naomi flew upwards with her hands merged together in front of her face, hiding the grin that she was sporting. Wind release. Changing currents. The wind started to flow in one direction, which had Karui believing a strike was going to come from there, but when it seemed like the perfect chance, the wind shifted direction at a much faster speed. This continued much to Karui's agitation and paranoia until Naomi put one palm over the back of her other hand. Wind release. Playground of the Twister. Naomi shouted with a small smirk because she didn't think that she would ever have enough time to perform this jutsu, but it would seem that Karui was more than glad to give her the time needed. The wind started to form into a circular wall of wind around the Kumogakure swordswoman, and soon the pressure got to be too much for Karui to stand on her feet. If her mind had been clearer, she would have remembered she could channel chakra to the soles of her feet. Karui started to get tossed from one section of the twister, elevating her body with each ejection from the twister. I didn't want to show off this much already, but I needed to so that maybe my ability could convince Nissan to help me further my training, so that I can use this move without needing my first jutsu. Plus, I'd be able to spend time with him. Naomi thought with a truly happy smile as the tornado started to dissipate. Karui fell onto her back with a number of cuts littered across her body and her trusty sword nowhere in sight. Naomi reached into her pouch and flicked a kunai at the downed Karui. The crowd gasped, believing that Naomi was killing someone out of cold blood, but sighed in relief when the kunai landed next to Karui's head. The proctor walked over to Karui and saw that she was unconscious and no longer in position to fight. Signaling for the medics to come and take away Karui, the proctor rose back to his feet and sent a small nod to Naomi, telling the redhead all she needed to know. Naomi started to walk away, not really finding herself wanting the praise of the public that had fallen so low in her eyes over the span of the tournament. Meanwhile, the crowd was clapping enthusiastically since one of their own defeated a foreign ninja. The most vocal, of course, was one very proud mother. "Kage Booth, your daughter is quite powerful, Hokage Dano. It is always nice to see a strong kunoichi coming up in the world." The world's first female Kage said while smiling as she watched the young Namikaze Uzumaki walking back towards the booth that held the genin. Mei at first was intrigued with Kuratsuchi, who could use Yotan like she did, but she was too arrogant for her liking. Minato nodded with a small smile on his face as his persona of a father took over his village leader persona for the time being. Yes, she is, they both are for that matter. I was surprised, however, that she had time to perform the jutsu that required her to use her final jutsu. That was something we did not count on, Minato admitted with a smaller smile as he started to shift back to his role as the Hokage. That Karui girl was foolish to sit there and allow her opponent to create a jutsu to defeat her. If this was an uncontrolled environment, she could have easily been killed. The Kazekage said sternly with his arms crossed tightly across his chest, ignoring the pointed look the headstrong Reikage was giving him. If the Reikage didn't like the truth, then he was just as foolish as his genin, and that was the Kazekage's thought process. Anoki nodded his head with an agreeable hum as he looked on as Karui was carried to the medics, where she would be until she woke up from her bout with unconsciousness. Watching as an enemy prepares to defeat you is definitely not a quality in Chunin, which in turn is a team leader in some cases. This only served to fuel the Reikage's glare, but even while cheering on his home, he could not dispute the words of his peers. "Your shinobi is up next, is she not, Tsuchikage Dano?" Mei asked an obvious question just to try and alleviate the tense atmosphere that was starting to accumulate around the 5 Kage level nin. The Sandaime Tsuchikage nodded his head with a small grin, since Yuna had proved herself well thus far without even revealing too much, showing she was using a shinobi's most powerful tool, deception. That she is. Combat field. Fu stared down Yuna with a rather heated look, since she was aware of the blushing state the diving helmet wearing kunoichi was in every time Naruto so much as glanced at her. Fu was not sure personally why she felt such an ugly feeling when she saw how Yuna was acting, and it seemed that Chome had no comment on her behavior. Fu looked past Yuna and saw Naruto glancing down at the field, but he seemed to not be looking at any one thing in certain. The mint-haired Jinchuriki from Taki had to win because she wanted to see Naruto kick her vile teammate Sari being all around the arena. Yuna too was lost in her own thoughts about how this tournament could play out from the matchups to the final result. Eventually her thoughts drifted towards Naruto and just the calm presence that he seemed to create by just being present. It was what she was looking for in a man unlike most she had seen so far. The men in the tournament either had a massive problem with energy, arrogance, or bloodlust, but not the raven-haired teen with his Sharingan. No, there was something different, something she wanted to get to know. The thought of that brought a serene smile to the Iwagakure Kunoichi. However, both knew for any advancement to continue they had to go through the person across from them, and that's what they would do. Yuna moved forth and threw a moderately quick punch, wanting to test how Fu's reaction time was, and Fu was not one to disappoint, as she moved her feet nimbly, shifting back, keeping the fist from contacting her face. Yuna grinned behind the cage on the front of helmet and threw a quicker corkscrew-like punch that hit with a solid thud. However, that solid thud was because Fu had brought her elbow up to block off the impactful smash of Yuna's fist. Fu, seeing the grinning face of Yuna, couldn't help but grin, as well, since not many of the Genin or Chunin could keep up with her. But here was another Kunoichi, which only made the experience that much more enjoyable for the Nanabai. Jinchuriki. Fu drove her knee up, but it was stopped when her opponent from Iwagakure blocked the advance with both of her hands. Using her newfound free hands, Fu threw out a hook to Yuna's throat, not wanting to smash her hand or knuckles against that helmet that Yuna was wearing. Yuna brought a hand up swiftly to catch the incoming fist, which got a smirk from the orange-eyed girl because her other fist was closing in on the opposite side. The smirk quickly changed faces when Yuna also easily blocked the second attack. Fu growled when Yuna refused to release her fists and did something she shouldn't have. Fu, without thinking about it, smashed her forehead against the part of the helmet just above the cage, getting dizzied looks in both girls' eyes. Fu because she had directly attacked the helmet, and Yuna because her head rattled in the helmet and the loud sound of Fu's head assaulting the helmet rung in closed space. Chome wasn't sure if he was supposed to laugh at Fu's dismissal of the obvious or shake his head at the stupidity, so in the end, he settled with one huge sweat drop on the back of his beetle-like head. Both girls got their bearings back at approximately the same time and stared at each other with much more serious-looking faces than before. Okay, that wasn't one of my brightest moments during a fight. Fu muttered to herself with a small shake of her head, trying to chase away the slight ring filling her ears. Yuna brought her hands to the sides of her helmet and sighed when she felt that the tubes were still lodged into the docking ports on the helmet. Yuna brought her hands down and pushed off her back foot towards Fu, taking the mint-haired teen by surprise. And in that shocked state, Fu was unable to counter as Yuna buried her foot straight to where Chome was sealed, getting Fu to gasp painfully. Growling with a slight scowl, Fu took hold of Yuna's ankle and spun her around twice, getting the Iwagakure Genin to yelp out in surprise as her world spun around and around. The spin cycle Fu was creating brought back up the vertigo from the helmet rattling, rendering Yuna incapable of sticking the landing, thus making her tumbling across the field. Fu quickly caught up to her opponent and before she could recover delivered a harsh straight right of her own into Yuna's stomach, making her grimace and roll away as a second punch fell to the ground where she was prone. Yuna got back to her feet and massaged the area struck with a small frown, but there was the competitive fire in her dark gray eyes. She would give it to her mint-haired opponent. She was agile and could hit with a nice amount of pop behind her strikes. But so were Yuna's attacks, and Fu could attest to that from how her gut felt from the few blows that Yuna had given her during their exchange. Both fighters came to the same conclusion that a taijutsu fight would only be a waste of energy with no winner being certain. Yuna grinned at her opponent, dusting off her clothing with an air of confidence surrounding her that made Fu bristle, but she didn't act on the feeling, she simply waited. Yuna, looking back at her opponent, rolled her shoulders and smirked. "Why don't we kick it up a notch, because I am really tired of going nowhere and fast?" Yuna offered, getting a small nod from Fu, who was feeling just the same but had yet to vocalize it. More excitable members of the audience moved towards the edge of their seats to see what the talented Kunoichi would show them. Combatant Booth. "Those two sure know what they are doing with their fists," Shikamaru said, watching the impressive hand-to-hand combat between the two Kunoichi. While normally the Nara heir would use the time to catch some shut-eye, he figured it would be best to keep tabs on potential fighters, though there was something else. "Why, yes, they are quite formidable in their own rights." Chojuro agreed, returning to his more shy side that he frequented when he was off the battlefield. One would think that being one of the legendary 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist would bring confidence or even arrogance, not a shy passive attitude. If the kunoichi in our village trained half as hard as those two have instead of trying to gain some boys' attention, then maybe I would admit that allowing them to be shinobi wasn't a mistake, but until that day comes. Naruto trailed off, getting a small giggle from both Haku and Yugito and face palms from his sisters, who were just ashamed to be part of this generation's kunoichi class in their village. Yes, fangirls are not cool, Samui added calmly with a small frown, remembering the few fangirls that were in Kumo, but not quite to the level of the Hidden Leaf's amount of fangirls and boys, thankfully. Gaara, who was standing off to the side, continued to shoot glances towards Naruto, ignoring the rants of his mother in favor of looking towards the enigma of the tournament. Naruto, who was aware of Gaara's eyes, ignored them for the moment in favor of watching the fight. Combat field. Water release. Violent water wave. Fu's mouth opened wide as a swirling tide of water stormed out straight for Yuna. Yuna watched as the water traveled the first few feet on the ground before springing high into the air, still based on the ground, creating a large, roaring wave of water. Yuna jumped back, going through the hand signs for her counter technique in response to Fu's offensive jutsu. Water release. Water encampment wall. Yuna hollered as a cylindrical wall of water shot from the ground around Yuna, spinning to keep its shape. The wave slammed into the wall, and the two sources of water created a light mist that sprinkled over the crowd. The wave of water was spilt when the wall proved to be too powerful, and then the wave parted around the wall of water. Leaving a Mizu Bunshin to fuel the jutsu, vanished in a jet stream of purple smoke from the top of her water wall. Fu, who was too indulged in watching her jutsu lose to Yuna's, wasn't paying attention as Yuna formed directly behind the Jinchuriki. "What are we looking at?" Yuna asked with a cheeky grin, getting Fu to tense when she sensed that Yuna was directly behind her. Fu tried to turn, but when she heard what Yuna said next, she knew it was a moment too late. Water release. Gunshot. Fu cried out when the concentrated orb of water blasted her behind the shoulders and through the air directly towards one of the stadium's walls. Yuna waited to see if her opponent would crash or if she could right herself before the wall did it for her. Just when it looked like it would be the latter, something Yuna was not expecting to happen, happened. Just before Fu could crash into the wall, a pair of green wings sprouted from her back and flapped, keeping her momentum from sending her crashing into the stadium wall. Fu thanked Chome as she turned to look at Yuna with a firm frown etched on her face. The crowd was left in awe as they watched the mint-haired kunoichi start to hover with the aid of Komiai's wings. However, Fu knew that if the villagers knew that she held a beast like Naruto did, they too would clamor for her head, as was typical for people who feared what they couldn't understand. Yuna looked at the forest, green wings that were currently coming from the back of her opponent from Takigakure with a scrutinizing gaze. That was when it clicked and she realized that she was actually fighting a Jinchuriki. Hansan told me of the tailed beasts and what village had which at the current time. If she has the 7-tailed beetle sealed within her, then I can't trade jutsu with her or she will outlast me. I need to finish this, but I need to get in close, which may be a problem with her flying. Yuna adopted a much more serious expression, now fully realizing just who she was dealing with. Secret Nanabai art. First hive. Upon Fu's command, which was basically the command of the grand insect, Chome, the small bugs swarmed around Yuna, who was trying to bat the small forms of life from the air. Fu let a small smirk play across her face because those small bugs were not normal chakra parasites. They were also created with a unique poison that would render her opponent immobile, making the fight come to, and smiled contently when she saw Yuna fall to the ground, but then her bugs fell dead, like a small bomb hit them. However, luckily one bug survived and returned to Fu with results. Fu girl. The bugs died because her chakra properties are greater than poisonous. They are Komiai's urgent voice was tuned out at the last moment in favor for Yuna's voice that was suddenly behind her and way too close for comfort. Taking your concentration off of your opponent, are we? Well, that's just foolish. Fu then felt 2 fingers touch the back of her neck at its base, and then the mint-haired Jinchuriki's world went dark. Her wings dissipating as her body shut down and her mind wandered into the realm of unconsciousness. Yuna landed on the ground lightly with a small sweat adorned on her brow from the jutsu she had to use in the fight, but she managed to save enough for the next rounds. The proctor moved closer to find that Fu was indeed out, unlike when Yuna faked it moments before the final attack. Winner by knockout, Yuna Nara. Combat field minutes later. Narumi stood looking at her classmate with a small smile, already knowing how gentle of a soul the boy had. The blonde-haired kunoichi knew that he was probably already having his doubts about fighting her, and the reason he got to this round was because the idiot Choji fought the round before called him fat. Narumi almost chuckled, remembering how funny it was watching the boy from Taki flee from Choji's righteous anger. Narumi let out a small sigh before regarding Choji with a much more serious look. Choji, I know you don't want to fight me, and I don't want to fight you. So please give up. Choji looked down into his bag of chips, his lips pursing down into a straight line as he contemplated the offer he was given. It was true that he really didn't wish to hurt any of his comrades. It was always like that, even since the academy. Plus, the young Akimichi wasn't even sure he could beat the Hokage's daughter. It was these kind of situations in which that Choji really missed the absence of Shikamaru. Plus, he wasn't even positive that he could make the rank of Chunin this year because even his clan techniques were lacking. I don't know. He only needs one little push. Narumi thought with a small, internal grin that she hid behind a calm visage. That grin would even make Naruto, when in his prankster mode, proud of his sister. Narumi was going through a small checklist of things that could tempt the snack-loving boy. She stopped dead when she realized that she was actually thinking about what she needed to tempt the snack-loving shinobi. I'm sure that Asuma-sensei promised you barbecue for winning your first-round match. Wouldn't you want to go there and enjoy your reward as soon as you can instead of being stuck in the medical ward where they won't let you eat? Choji's eyes went wide when he realized the grave consequences of being stuck inside of a hospital bed. Not only would he not be able to eat, but he would also have to wait to go to his precious barbecue. His hands clenched slightly over his bag of chips, getting a small smirk from Narumi, seeing as how the gears were going in Choji's mind. Narumi stood there waiting patiently for the Akimichi heir's decision, as was the proctor, since she had yet to move, seeing as the two comrades were being rather friendly. All right, Proctor-sen, I give up on the match, Choji said with a small smile, obviously not all that beat up over forfeiting. The entire stadium sat in absolute silence at Choji's rather easy-going way of surrendering the match. Even the kunoichi from Kumo, who was acting as the proctor, was looking at the Akimichi like he had grown a second head, and that head belonged to Orochimaru. Every soul was thinking how he could pass up the chance to prove his worth. The only person who didn't seem shocked was the Nara in the competition, who wore a fond smile as he shook his head lightly. The proctor was the first to break from the shock that had descended down on the stadium, but not before giving Choji one small disbelieving glance. Winner by verbal surrender, Narumi Namikaze Uzumaki. In the stands. Did that just happen? Konoha's snake mistress asked in shock, even stopping from eating her dango so that she could try and figure out if what happened was real. Her best friend Kurinai wasn't all that sure either, and even thought to check to see if it was a genjutsu. Kushina, however, couldn't help it as she started to break out into laughter, even going so far as to grip her ribs as her body shook with laughter. While it may have seemed like Narumi was trying to help Choji, all it really did was save her from a fight and conserve chakra. That's my girl. Asuma took a new cancer stick, replacing the one that dropped to the dirty ground when Choji quit without lifting a finger. Shaking his head, the bearded jounin knew it was a mistake to promise his student barbecue before he was done fighting. What can you do? Asuma breathed out a sigh with a small shrug. Sakura was giggling, but not at Choji. No, she was giggling that her rival was wearing such a dumbfounded expression. Wiping the imaginary tear from her eye with her one good hand, Sakura turned to the Yamanaka heiress with a sly grin. So that's your teammate Aino? Oh, that's rich. The platinum blonde-haired kunoichi's brow started to twitch hearing her rival's words. She couldn't help but sneer with displeasure. It was also the anger that made the words come from her mouth that she hadn't spoken in quite a while. Shut up, billboard brow. Sakura gasped, her eyes going wide before her hair shadowed her eyes, her one good hand clenching into a fist as she spoke. No, you shut up, Ino pig. And like that, the two were forehead to forehead, growling at each other. Combat field. Haku stood silently watching as Samui pulled out her weapon of choice, the tanto, and brandished it a few times underneath the sun's intense spotlight. Haku watched on silently, not intimidated by the display but silently admitting that it was cool. Haku responded in kind by drawing the handle of Snowfall. This action caught the Kumogakure kunoichi's attention as she watched on as a long, slightly curved blade sprung from the hilt. Samui allowed a frown to grace her beautiful face when she saw she was already at a disadvantage. Haku's sword was longer and could be augmented with chakra. Samui decided to try and use an unsavory tactic. You know that my sensei is an expert with a sword. Challenging me would most certainly lead to your defeat. Haku looked at her blonde opponent with a slight tilt to her head, since it didn't seem like Samui was the arrogant type. No, it had to be that she didn't want to have to deal with the challenges Snowfall provided her. Haku shook her head with a pleasant smile, sticking her left foot in front of her right with her sword held out like a katana. She could never face Zabuza if she gave up so easily, just like Choji had done minutes earlier. I am sorry, Samui-san, but I could never give up so easily. Zabuza-sama would never forgive me for taking such a way out. Samui nodded and sped forward towards Haku, who had already began her swing, almost cut Samui across the abdomen, but the blonde kunoichi managed to halt all of her momentum. Haku smiled, ignoring Samui's discontent expression, opting to step forward with a downward slice with her blade made of ice. Samui stopped the ice sword with her tanto, holding her metallic blade against the base of the ice-natured weapon. Growling slightly, Samui lashed out with a swift kick for Haku's midsection. Haku's eyes glanced down the moment Samui's foot started to move, giving the ice kunoichi plenty of time to dodge. The blonde from Kumo decided she would take the attack to the raven-haired girl from the village hidden in the mist. A quick slash from the short blade towards the long ice blade was easily blocked, but Samui had another trick ready this time. A sudden charge of electricity ran through the blade, shattering the ice and cutting across Haku's forearms when she blocked her torso from being stabbed. Haku shook away the tingling feeling in her arms in favor for channeling her chakra back into Snowfall, creating an exact copy of her first weapon. Haku lowered her blade back down, assuming the ready stance once more. Samui's eyes narrowed at her opponent, confused as to why she would recreate the same weapon when the outcome was obvious. Shrugging away that thought, Samui went forth, but this time ready to score a more debilitating hit. Her lightning-charged tanto descended towards the ice blade, but just before the weapons came into contact, Snowfall's from shifted. The blade shifted into more of a snowy breeze, and the wind killed the lightning charge, and the ice crystals cut across the top of Samui's arms. The two kunoichi shared a relatively heated glare before starting to go through hand seals simultaneously. Naruto's mindscape. Naruto's Sharingan glanced around in a momentary stupor, finding not a combat field but crimson-stoned masonry. Looking up, Naruto saw the same crimson. Faint light diluted in the air, and Naruto knew just where he was, his mindscape. Of course, his resident demon had something that he needed to tell him. Naruto started to make his way down the dimly lit corridors with a small sigh. I guess I will see what the Kyuubi needs of me. It didn't take long for Naruto to come to the familiar cage that the Kyuubi resided in. Naruto stood there silently as the large slitted orbs came to life. The raven-haired shinobi stood there motionless, waiting for the large fox to reveal himself. A large chuckle blew the sewer water up, getting a light soak on his cloak, earning a scowl. Naruto was just glad that the water didn't have any kind of stench to it. Naruto asked, slightly miffed he was about to miss a promising fight unlike those prior. Tell me, Kyuubi, why did you call for me? The Kyuubi, who could sense Naruto's irritation, just laughed a little louder and longer than he would have under normal circumstances. The Kyuubi's three tails swayed around in what Naruto would guess to be amusement. A terrifying streak of white signaled the Kyuubi's malicious grin. Oh please, I have been watching those pesky flies fight, and there was nothing entertaining about this little spectacle. Anyways, I have some information that may or may not interest you, Ninjen. Naruto's eyebrow rose, since this was a new interaction with the Kyuubi after months of on and off again conversation. Never had the Kyuubi been forthcoming with information. No, Naruto would have to go and ask if the Kyuubi had anything that could be helpful. Noting that he might have to return this for a favor, Naruto decided to take this gift he was being given. Okay, then what is it? Naruto asked, easily forgetting his irritation. One of my brothers, so to speak, has been reincarnated into this world. And from the sense of it, I would say it was the three tails. The Kyuubi said, with one eye open, regarding Naruto to see what his pseudo-container's reaction would be. As the Kyuubi expected, Naruto's only visible reaction was a gentle nodding of his head. Naruto nodded, taking the information because it was clearly valuable, but the problem was where the sanbai would show up. Do you have an idea as to where the sanbai could be? Naruto asked curiously, since the Kyuubi was like a vast wealth of knowledge and it couldn't hurt to try and dip his hand into it. The QB grunted slightly, closing his other eye, letting his tails fall down to the ground, almost giving off the vibe that he had suddenly fell asleep. Naruto waited patiently as the QB started to think about his question. Well, when a tailed beast shows back up, it is like a brief beacon flash to the other Biju before we fall into hibernation so we regain our power. When we tailed beasts are reincarnated, we often show up in the place where we are most in tune with in accordance of nature. So I believe that turtle will be somewhere watery. Naruto closed his eyes and thought about that comment. It was very clear to the shinobi that the three tails would come back to the world within the land of water, but sadly Naruto didn't have any kind of influence within that land. Naruto shrugged softly, since maybe in time he would, but not now. He did believe that the Biju sensing power was indeed convenient, but why complain about that? So what can I do for you then? Naruto asked, opening both of his red eyes, getting the QB to look directly at Naruto. Well, you can change the mindscape from this damnable sewer to something more hospitable, because as shocking as it may be, I don't always wish to watch your life unfold. The QB snorted, forcing himself to put a little venom behind his words, getting a light chuckle from Naruto. Nodding his head, Naruto stepped back and sat in a meditative position to focus his mental energy. The QB watched on as the bars slowly slammed back into the ground and the water drained away. Slowly, green grass grew across the now field, followed up by a vast forest growing in the background. The flat ground the two were standing upon started to elevate up into the sky, creating a large hill where the QB was now basking on. Naruto focused in creating a few minor details within the forest for the QB to enjoy later. There, I hope you enjoy your temporary home. The QB grunted and whipped his tail through Naruto's midsection, but it phased through like Naruto was intangible, something that happened often. In the mindscape, the QB couldn't harm Naruto unless Naruto openly accepted the confrontation. Just get out of here. We have been here too long, and now you are needed outside. And with that, Naruto was forcibly ejected from the mindscape, much to Naruto's amusement, fully knowing that the QB just didn't want to show positive emotions. Combatant booth. Naruto-kun. Naruto's eyes snapped open, hearing that feminine shout, coming back to reality. Naruto looked to see everyone in the booth looking at him, but it was Suisei that got to him through the soul link. Naruto-kun, it is your turn to fight. Suisei repeated, wondering what had happened to her partner, but that could be explained at a later time. Naruto looked down at the field to see Fu's teammate with the blue scar leering up at him, and Naruto's eyes narrowed. Naruto leaped down over the railing with Suisei perched on his shoulder, something that didn't bother Naruto one bit. Naruto ignored the glare, the boy with scarf around his deformed jaw, in favor of a silent stoicism. Suisei giggled through the link, seeing just how angry that their opponent was getting thanks to Naruto's cool persona. The proctor asked if Shirku was ready, earning an immediate nod, and when the same question came to Naruto, he just stared at the Takinin. The proctor took the silence as a yes and started the match and leapt away, wanting to stay away from the Uchiha. Finally, I can pay you back for what you did to me back in that stupid tower. You thought you were so great, but all you did was catch me by surprise. That's why this time will be so different. This time you will be begging at my feet in front of the entire world. Shirku's arrogance wasn't muffled by the scarf that muffled his voice. Naruto shook his head as Shirku started to channel his chakra into his seals, but Naruto didn't move a muscle. Just before Shirku could finish the series of signs, Naruto looked over at Shirku with the cool, blue eyes he had seen before. You are a fool. You think that I was lucky because I inspired fear in you? No, it was not luck that was the difference in our skills. You pose no threat even with any skills you may have acquired. Naruto spoke calmly, but the words cut into Shirku, getting the boy to even halt his jutsu just before it was complete. Get ready, QB, we are going with that. Naruto said mentally after using one of Itachi's favorite tactics to stall Shirku. Itachi had always used a fake arrogance to get into his enemy's head, but somewhere deep inside Naruto actually believed what he had said. Shirku growled at Naruto, who ignored in favor of creating 20 Kage Bunshin without even using a hand sign. The shinobi in the crowd were all amazed that Naruto could split his chakra evenly 20 times without looking fatigued. The shadow clones surrounded Shirku in a tight circle, and Shirku tensed, believing he was about to be attacked. The clones all dispelled at the same time, creating a massive wave of smoke to spread around the field. Naruto raced into the crowd with his cursed eyes active so he could see through the smokescreen. The crowd all waited to see just what was going to come from the smoke. Eventually the smoke cleared and an unharmed Shirku was standing in the middle of a complex array of symbols and kanji. Those in the crowd familiar with the art of sealing could see the words connect, mind, and imprison, but yet some of the things were still unreadable even to Minato, Jiraiya, and to a lesser extent Kushina. Naruto jumped back a few feet from the sealing array and held a single hand seal channeling his chakra. Whirlpool Shadow Style, Genfuin Hybrid, Palace of Nightmares. The world around Shirku changed from the stadium to a replica of Konoha during the nighttime. Shirku looked around. Suddenly there was a large explosion and multiple buildings caught fire, creating a large inferno. Shirku looked around in a panic as people started to run around in a crazed frenzy, confusing Shirku. That was when a massive shadow overtook the space he was standing in. Looking up, Shirku gulped. When he looked up, he was greeted by the massive stature of the Kyuubi grinning down manically at him. Shirku stumbled back a few feet before turning on his feet and sprinted off with the mass amount of Konoha citizens. The Kyuubi chuckled darkly and started to walk through the village, creating a massive amount of destruction. Shirku looked up hoping to find anything to save him, but all he saw was a dark sky. But this sky wasn't dark due to the night, no, it was darkened by the ash and smoke of a burning Konoha. He could feel his body physically expressing his fear through the cold sweat on his body and the hammering of his heart inside of his chest. Looking back only created a faster beating as he looked right into the red eyes of the Kyuubi as it got closer and closer despite his terrified shouts for the monster of destruction to stop. Shirku allowed a smile to cross his face when he caught sight of the massive gates of Konoha, his escape just a few feet away. Just when he was about to escape the nightmarish hell, his body was suddenly forced back by an invisible force, knocking the teen down onto his rear. Shirku felt his throat go dry as he heard the monstrous chuckle from behind him, made his heart stop just a beat. Standing up, Shirku stumbled backwards, the invisible wall keeping him upright as the Kyuubi grinned evilly at the boy who hated demons and just how much he would enjoy this. The Kyuubi brought his paw forth and let it loom overhead, absolutely terrifying the boy beneath him. Then, at an inhumane speed, a single claw shot forward and impaled the boy through the stomach. Slowly, the Kyuubi raised his claw, cutting Shirku in half, creating a massive puddle of blood and organs. As the world faded, the Kyuubi's evil chuckle was the last sound in the nightmare world. Combat field. Naruto and the rest of the crowd watched as Shirku stood there in the middle of his glowing seal. Soon the crowd watched as a cold sweat became visible on his exposed skin that continued to get more intense. Then, to the shock of all those watching besides Naruto, Shirku fell over, spitting blood all over the seal on the ground. The crowd all went deathly silent as the proctor hurried over to the Taki teen. The expression on his face became grave when the teen's chest stopped rising. Standing up, the proctor faced the crowd with the same expression on his face. Winner by death, Naruto Namikaze Uzumaki. Information, Palace of Nightmares. The user uses a various amount of complex seals and kanji to trap anyone inside of the seal within a prison of their choice. The damage down to the person in the jutsu becomes transferred to their body and affects them internally. The only way to break the jutsu was to destroy the array with an infusion of foreign chakra and overpowering the source chakra. Review response. Not much this time since I have answered these before. Naruto's Mangekyo Sharingan abilities. Still not set in stone aside from the Tsukuyomi, Susanoo, and Amaterasu. I am leaning towards an ability I have in mind that can spring another idea I have, but that time will come. Naruto's love life. Indeed, you could call this a harem, but it will be different than most stories because he won't constantly be swarmed by women. No, they each will have their own time and sometimes be around Naruto, but not all at once. The second summon. I probably won't choose the phoenix or dragon because let's face it, those are really cliché. Just like the Sharingan, this too is not completely determined, though the person who mentioned Baku gave a strong contender.